Welcome to the deep dive. You know how this works. We dig through piles of research so you don't have to. And today, we're diving deep into the world of soft robotics. And we've got a ton of fascinating material to explore.
Yeah, that's right. A lot of our focus today is going to be on this book series, actually. It's called Soft Robotics: Trends, Applications, and Challenges. And it really gets into, the whole idea of how biology inspires engineering, like how we
Yeah.
can use nature to build better machines, and how that all feeds into things like developing new tools for, the medical field and stuff.
And it's funny you should mention that because, this cover image right here,
Yeah.
this robotic hand prosthesis from the Life Hand Project. I mean, that pretty much sums it all up, right? It just screams bio-inspiration. And it kind of shows you, the whole connection between, like, humans and robots and the potential to really, like, make a difference in people's lives. And, of
Yeah.
course, you've got contributions from, RoboSoft, and they have that whole Soft Robotics Week thing going on. So it's clearly a field that's, like, really taking off.
Yeah, absolutely. And, within that, we're going to be looking at stuff like how do we give soft robots a sense of touch? We'll be talking about, electronic skins and things like that. And we'll dive into how they actually sense their surroundings, the whole mechanosensing side of things. And, 3D printing. There's some really exciting stuff happening with like 3D printed soft hands and things. And then like we're even going underwater. There's soft robots that can swim, robots that can grow like plants, robots that can fly,
Wow.
soft robots for surgery. And then kind of more on the engineering side, how do you combine soft and rigid materials to, kind of get the best of both worlds? And then, robots for the environment. And then some really like kind of heady concepts around like modeling and controlling these things because it gets pretty complicated. And then, yeah, some really far out stuff around like how these robots might actually evolve and even like change their physical form over time.
So basically, we're going to give you the lowdown on the latest trends, the craziest applications, and all the like basic principles that make soft robotics tick. And we'll do it without, bogging you down with too much technical jargon.
Exactly.
So let's get started, shall we? And I guess, the first thing we should probably talk about is like the whole bio-inspiration thing.
Right.
Like nature is kind of the starting point for a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, for sure. And, that's a big theme throughout this whole book series. And, one thing they point out is like, think about the human hand for a second. A quarter of the motor cortex in our brain is actually dedicated to controlling like 34 muscles in our hand.
Right.
So, I mean, that in itself tells you something about like how complex that is and how much that's driving, the design of sophisticated, soft robotic hands.
Yeah, and it makes you realize how amazing something is that we just, like, takes for granted.
Right.
And, they talk about this concept of, like, synergies.
Mm.
In terms of how our hands work, like, it's not just that our brain is individually controlling every single joint, when we grab something.
Yeah, it's like we have these pre-programmed patterns of movement almost, but if our hands were completely rigid, then those patterns would be like really limited in terms of what they could do. But here's the thing. Our hands aren't rigid. The flexibility of our muscles and our skin and even the object that we're holding, that all plays a role in how we group things. And so there's this idea of soft synergy where the hands compliance actually allows for a wider range of contact points, even with the same basic joint movements. So the takeaway here is that if we want to build robots that can, manipulate objects with the same kind of dexterity that we do, we need to move beyond, rigid mechanics.
So essentially, by making these robotic hands more flexible, they gain this, like, adaptability.
Right. And they mention a few examples in here, like the PISA IIT soft hand and the ISR soft hand. I think the ISR soft hand is supposed to be able to perform like 31 out of the 33 common grasps that humans use.
Wow, that's impressive.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible.
And, this is where it becomes really relevant for, like, prosthetic hands.
Yeah.
If you can have a hand that's more adaptable, it's going to fit better around objects. And, the use of soft skin, that's going to improve contact and even, like, friction, so it's easier to hold things securely. And then, of course, it opens up the possibility of, like, integrating touch sensors directly into the hand itself.
Which leads us nicely to our next topic, right? Like, how do these soft robots actually sense the world around them? Because it's one thing to be squishy and flexible, but it's another thing to actually, like, know what you're touching. Yeah, exactly. And the chapter on soft robotics mechanosensing really gets into that. And, the basic idea is that if you want a soft robot to work effectively in like an unstructured environment, it needs to be able to sense things like mechanical forces, pressure, even its own movements.
Right.
Because if it's going to adapt to, unexpected situations or handle delicate objects, it needs to be able to get feedback from its interactions with the world.
So it's not just about sensing like external things. That's what they call exteroception, right?
Right.
But also like the robot being aware of its own body position.
Yeah, proprioception.
Proprioception, exactly.
And there's some really ingenious ways they're doing this with soft robots. There's examples using inspiration from octopus arms, where they're actually weaving resistive strain sensors into conductive fabrics to determine, how the arm is bending and things like that. And then there's these crawling robots that have this amazing, hyperelastic electroluminescent skin.
So like the robot's skin is actually a sensor.
Yeah, it's not just a sensor, it's like part of the robot. And by analyzing how the skin, stretches and how it emits light, they can actually sense both, the robot's own deformation and like external pressures.
Wow.
So it's like a combined sense of touch and movement, basically.
That's incredible. And they also talk about this trend towards like what they call multimodal sensing. So basically being able to tell the difference between different kinds of mechanical stimuli.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that it's becoming more and more like a symbiotic relationship between the sensing and the robot's body. It's not just that you add sensors on top of something. It's like they're integrated at a fundamental level.
Right.
And electrotextiles or e-textiles, these conductive fabrics, are playing a big role in that because they have the potential to create, low cost and really robust sensors.
And they even talk about like these highly sensitive three-axial force sensors that are made from like elastomers and e-textiles. And they can obviously detect both, normal forces like pushing down, but also tangential forces. So like the forces that are kind of sideways.
Yeah, which is really important for manipulation tasks. And then, getting even more bio-inspired, there's research into what they call like plant-inspired mechanoperception. So think about how a plant root navigates through soil.
Right.
They're actually developing soft robots that have these capacitive sensing elements that can distinguish between pushing against a convex or concave surface or whether they're being bent or indented. So
essentially they're taking inspiration from like a plant root to build a better robot.
Exactly.
That's wild. So, all right, we've got these flexible robots. They can sense their environment. How do we actually make these things? How do we manufacture them? And I guess, one of the big things that comes up is 3D printing.
Yeah, absolutely. And the chapter on towards behavior design of a 3D printed soft robotic hand, it really gets into that. And, one of the common ways to actuate or to move soft robots is through pneumatics. So basically by inflating channels within the material. But, traditionally, a lot of these things were made using molds.
Right.
Which can be pretty limiting in terms of, what you can design.
Yeah, you're stuck with, the shape of the mold.
Exactly. But 3D printing or additive manufacturing, that completely changes the game.
Right.
Because it allows for so much more design freedom, and you can actually integrate, actuators and sensors directly into the structure, layer by layer.
Yeah.
And so it's not just about, printing shapes. It's actually about designing the behavior of the robot directly into its physical form.
So you're not just building a robot, you're building a robot that's pre-programmed to move a certain way.
Yeah, exactly. And they give some really cool examples of 3D printed actuators. There's one that's inspired by an elephant's trunk.
Oh.
It uses a helical bellow to create rotational movement.
Oh, that's cool. So does the helical structure, does that offer any advantages in terms of torque or range of motion?
Yeah, I mean, it allows for a compact yet powerful rotational motion, kind of like how an elephant's trunk can, twist and turn with so much force. And they also talk about bending actuators that use double bellows to increase stiffness and even sensing air chambers that could provide feedback on, pressure and movement and things like that. And ultimately, what they're working towards in that chapter is the creation of a fully 3D printed soft robotic hand that's designed for human machine interaction.
Yeah.
Specifically for something as simple as shaking hands.
Oh, wow.
Which is pretty cool when you think about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's really taking it to a whole other level. All right. So let's take these soft robots out of the lab and, see what they can do in the real world. And I guess the first place we should go is underwater.
Right. So the chapter on soft robotics and underwater legged locomotion, it talks about like a big challenge in marine robotics, which is that, a lot of underwater vehicles, they work great in open water, but when it comes to interacting with structures or like the seabed, it gets a lot trickier, especially for those, traditional rigid robots.
Yeah, they can get tangled up. They can damage, delicate environments. They might not be able to handle like uneven surfaces on the ocean floor.
Right. And that's where, bio-inspired soft robots come in.
Yeah.
Because they offer, this increased interaction and kind of motion capabilities. And of course, the octopus, with its amazing dexterity and adaptability, that's a big inspiration for, both crawling and legged locomotion underwater. And, what's really cool is that they're actually adapting principles from like land animals. Like there's this thing called the spring-loaded inverted pendulum model, or SLAP model, which is used to study like running and things. They're actually adapting that for underwater locomotion.
Really?
Yeah. And they call it the USLIP model. And they've even built this like one-legged hopping robot that can self-stabilize on uneven underwater terrain.
Wow. A hopping robot underwater. That's a new one. I've never heard of that before. But it really shows you like the potential of thinking outside the box, or maybe we should say outside the rigid hull.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
And then they also get into this really interesting aspect of aquatic movement, which is like how changes in body shape can actually contribute to propulsion.
Yeah, that's a fascinating one. And it has to do with this concept of added mass, which is basically the inertia of the water that's being, displaced and moved by the body. And so the chapter on the benefit of body shape variations in aquatic propulsion explains how by dynamically altering its shape, a robot can actually like modify its added mass and potentially generate thrust.
So it's not just about pushing water backward with like a propeller or a fin.
Right.
It's about like the act of changing shape can create movement.
Yeah, because you're essentially using the inertia of the water to your advantage. And they describe this experiment with a shape-changing spring mass oscillator and like numerical simulations that show how pulsating the body can actually like cancel out the drag of the water and sustain oscillation.
Oh, wow.
And they also talk about this thing called added mass recovery,
Mhm.
where, a self-propelled vehicle that has like an elastic membrane, it can actually increase its thrust and acceleration simply by contracting its body compared to like a rigid body using the same propulsive force.
So it's like it's harnessing the water's own inertia to like propel itself forward.
Exactly.
That's really cool. And then, staying with the bio-inspiration theme, there's this whole section on animal models for non-pneumatic soft robots.
Yeah.
They basically say that, soft-bodied animals are like living prototypes for robot design.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to put it. But they also stress that, soft-bodied animals, they have this huge diversity in like their biomechanics and their control systems.
Yeah.
So we have to be like really careful about, how we draw inspiration from them. And, while a lot of soft robots are inspired by things like, worms and octopuses that use fluid pressure to move, there's a whole other world of inspiration out there in like insects.
Right.
And especially insect larvae like caterpillars.
So what makes, like caterpillars, what makes them such good models for non-pneumatics soft robots?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, they don't rely on fluid pressure for movement. They actually use like direct muscle actuation through these internal air tubes. And they have this really kind of consistent and modular body structure. And their neural control mechanisms are like relatively accessible to study. And, what's really cool is that they've actually been able to translate like principles of caterpillar locomotion into robot designs. Yeah. They've created robots that are powered by like shape memory actuators and motor tendons. And these robots have actually shown like really promising capabilities for navigating like complex and even low gravity environments.
Yeah.
So
instead of just like copying the outward appearance, they're really trying to replicate like the fundamental principles of how it moves.
exactly.
That's really fascinating. All right, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about robots that can grow. Now, this is something I've never even like thought of before.
Yeah, this is a really cool one. So the chapter on plant-inspired growing robots, it talks about how, plant roots can penetrate soil with like minimal resistance and friction.
Right.
Because they elongate at their tips.
Right.
So it's a really clever strategy.
Yeah. So instead of like mechanically pushing their way through the soil, they're basically adding new material at the front.
Exactly. And so they've actually developed robotic systems that are inspired by this. There's a robot that can penetrate like granular materials by adding new material at its apex. So they call it artificial growth. And some of them even incorporate like soft hairs to provide, self-anchorage within the soil.
Huh.
And there's one example where the robot actually grows at its tip by like feeding out a filament from an internal spool.
Wow.
And this approach has been shown to like consume way less energy compared to, traditional penetration techniques.
So imagine like you could have robots that could explore like really confined spaces or even like repair structures by like growing into them.
Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty wild. All right, so let's go from underground to the skies and talk about bio-inspired soft aerial robots. And this section talks about how, controlled flexibility is actually like a key feature in biological flight.
Yeah, absolutely. And, think about like bird wings.
Right.
They can morph into all these different configurations, for soaring, for flapping, for everything in between. And this like adaptive wing morphology, along with, the flexibility of insect wings, that contributes a lot to like energy efficiency, maneuverability, and robustness during flight.
So it's not just about like flapping harder, it's about like changing the shape of the wing itself.
Exactly. And, nature has all these examples of like multimodal mobility in the air. You've got like jump gliding animals, diving birds, and they all rely on like soft, deployable, or adaptable structures. And even the act of like perching, landing on a surface, like, that's often facilitated by like soft compliant legs or tendon-based claw mechanisms that provide like passive damping and, secure attachment. And then you even have things like, aerial construction, like swiftlets building their nests out of saliva, which acts as both like a structure and an adhesive. And they highlight some really cool robotic examples, inspired by all of this. Like there's this thing called the Aqua MAV, which can actually transition between air and water. And it uses a water jet propulsion system that's inspired by like flying squid.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then, robotic perching mechanisms that are designed for like energy saving and even like aerial 3D printing of polyurethane foam for building structures in, hard to reach places.
Wow. So really, soft robotics is opening up all these new possibilities for like what aerial robots can do and where they can go.
Yeah, exactly. From, exploration to construction. It's pretty amazing. All right, let's come back down to Earth, shall we, and talk about a more kind of intricate and delicate application, surgery.
All right. So the section on soft robots and surgery talks about, the limitations of traditional rigid instruments and minimally invasive surgery,
Yeah.
MIS. And it really focuses on like the flexibility and dexterity issue.
Right.
Like how do you get a robot to move around inside the human body with the same kind of, finesse as a surgeon's hand?
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. And, robotics has brought a lot of advancements to MIS, like, increased accuracy, the possibility of like teleoperation, where the surgeon is controlling the robot remotely. But replicating the flexibility and dexterity of the human hand, that's still a big hurdle.
Yep.
And that's where soft-bodied robots really come into play because, they have this ability to passively adapt to the body's contours. And they can even be designed to, like, collapse for insertion through really small incisions. And, this is especially relevant for, like, endoluminal and endocavitary surgery. So, surgery inside, like,
Right.
tubular structures or body cavities.
Right. And they talk about this stiff L-flop manipulator
Yeah.
as an example of a soft surgical robot. So what makes that one so special?
Well, it's really innovative because it uses fluidic actuation. So basically using fluids to control its movement, and that allows it to achieve both like a high degree of dexterity and also the ability to like change its stiffness on demand.
Wow.
Which is really important when you're working with, delicate tissues and you need to be able to like move around precisely and safely. And they've even integrated it with like the Da Vinci surgical robot system.
Oh, wow.
So while there are still some challenges in like manufacturing these soft surgical robots, the potential is huge because they can really overcome the limitations of those rigid instruments, especially for, complex procedures.
So it sounds like, soft robotics could really revolutionize the way surgeons operate in the future.
Definitely.
All right, so let's talk about, combining the best of both worlds, soft and rigid, with design principles for soft rigid hybrid manipulators. So why combine the two?
Well, the idea is to get, both the strength and precision of rigid structures, but also the flexibility and adaptability of soft materials. And, they lay out these 4 design principles for how to do that.
Okay, so let's go through those principles.
So the first one is articulated link structure, and that's basically about using, rigid links and soft joints to achieve both like form and force closure. So think of it like a gripper that has like rigid segments connected by hinges made of, some kind of soft compliant material.
Right.
The second principle is tendon actuation, and that's using tendons to actuate, soft jointed links remotely without actually like distorting the soft body itself.
Okay.
The third one is differential stiffness via multi-material usage. So that's basically about combining materials with different stiffness properties to control the motion. So you might have like high tensile tendons working with, flexible joints and like strong links.
Yeah.
And then the final principle is guided soft joints. And that's using like the link geometry and the tendon routing to control the movement of, multi-directional soft joints. So it's about enhancing both adaptability and durability.
So basically with these hybrid designs, they're trying to like bridge the gap between purely soft robots and purely rigid robots.
Yeah, exactly. They want something that's safer for handling delicate objects, but can still provide, the force and precision you need for more demanding tasks.
All right. So let's zoom out a little bit and talk about the bigger picture.
Sure.
How do these technologies impact the environment?
Right. So environmental robots, towards a symbiotic relationship with nature. That chapter really gets into that. And, they talk about how technological advancement can really put a strain on our planet's resources, from the rare earth materials used in electronics to the lithium in batteries, all of that has an environmental footprint. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of pollution from, industrial and agricultural activities. And so this chapter explores the idea of robots that can not only operate within the environment, but actually contribute to, a more sustainable future.
Yeah, they give the example of like microbial fuel cells.
Yeah, MFCs.
MFCs.
Yeah.
As like a biomimetic, environmentally friendly power source.
Right. And they talk about this robot called the Robot, which is an environmentally integrated robot that's inspired by the water boatman insect.
Ooh.
And this robot uses an MFC stomach to generate energy by processing nutrients in the water. And it has this soft robotic mouth for feeding. So it's like a self-sustaining robot that can operate autonomously in, aquatic environments.
So instead of just like taking resources from the environment, it's actually like contributing to the ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. It's a more symbiotic relationship.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
All right, so let's get a little bit technical here. How do you actually control these, super deformable soft robots? It seems like it would be really challenging.
Yeah, it definitely is. And so the chapter on soft robot modeling, simulation and control in real time gets into that.
Yeah.
And they basically say that, the traditional methods for controlling robots, they don't really work for soft robots because they have like almost infinite degrees of freedom. They can bend and twist in so many ways.
Right.
So what they're doing is they're using real-time models based on finite element methods, or FEM.
Okay.
And they use these for both simulation and like inverse kinematic control. So basically to figure out, how to make the robot move the way they want it to.
So instead of just like pre-programming a sequence of actions,
Yeah.
it's more like the robot's movements are based on like continuous understanding of its physical properties and how it's interacting with the world.
Exactly. And, they describe this whole mathematical framework that takes into account like all these different forces and the stiffness of the material and the different types of actuators they're using. And the way it works is, they first have to figure out the like free configuration of the robot, so like how it would look without any constraints. And then they use these optimization algorithms to calculate, how to actuate it to achieve a certain position or to simulate how it would respond to like certain inputs and environmental contacts. So it's pretty complex stuff.
Yeah, sounds like it. But, it seems like that kind of like real-time modeling and simulation is essential if you want soft robots to do, complex tasks in the real world.
Totally.
All right. So let's finish up with what I think is like the most mind-blowing part of this whole thing, which is evolutionary developmental soft robotics and morphosis.
Yeah, those are really pushing the boundaries. So evolutionary developmental soft robotics, that basically draws inspiration from like natural evolution and biological development to automate the design process for robots.
Wow.
So the idea is that, instead of having engineers like meticulously design every single detail. You use algorithms that mimic like natural selection and how organisms develop over time to optimize, the robot's morphology, its control system, its sensory capabilities, all for, specific tasks and operating environments.
So, like, the robots are, in a sense, evolving their own designs.
Yeah, pretty much. And they also talk about this concept of environment-mediated development, where the robot can actually adapt its physical characteristics based on, environmental cues and stimuli that it encounters during its lifetime. And this is all tied into like this idea of embodied intelligence, where the robot's intelligence kind of emerges from the interplay between, its control system, its body, its materials, and the environment itself.
So it's not just reacting to the environment. It's
Right.
actually, like, changing its physical form in response.
Exactly. And they give some examples of like evolving, growing soft robots that can, perform tasks like moving towards a light source. And it really shows how, evolution can discover effective morphologies and developmental processes and how important, material properties are in all of this.
That's incredible. And then there's morphosis. So what is that exactly?
Well, it kind of takes this idea of morphological computation to a whole other level. And morphological computation is basically where the robot uses its physical body to perform computations that are relevant to, interacting with the world. But the limitation there is that, like, the functionality is pretty much fixed by its design.
Right.
But morphosis is all about enabling robots to dynamically reconfigure their bodies in real time to adapt to changing environments and new tasks.
So instead of just, like, changing its behavior, it's actually changing its shape.
Yeah, exactly. And they explain it from like a dynamical systems perspective, where the robot can like reshape its attractor landscape, which basically represents its stable patterns of behavior to make it easier to switch between different actions.
Yeah.
And they give examples of like a hopping robot that can change the stiffness of its legs to be more energy efficient on different types of ground,
Oh.
or a robot that can reconfigure its like leg mechanism to achieve different gaits and different movements depending on the terrain. And there's one really cool example where they use like evolutionary design to create soft underwater robots that can actually switch between like walking, swimming, crawling, hopping, all by just like slightly adjusting one morphological parameter.
Wow.
And they do it with a constant control strategy.
So morphosis is basically about creating robots that are, like, super versatile, super energy efficient, and potentially a lot simpler to control because so much of the adaptation happens passively through their physical form.
Exactly. It has the potential to like completely change robotics as we know it.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of bioinspiration to the, mind-bending possibilities of morphosis. We've talked about how flexibility can make robotic hands way more capable, the crazy ways that soft robots can sense their surroundings, how 3D printing is changing the game, and all the different applications in, underwater exploration, aerial robotics, surgery, even environmental sustainability. We've also touched on the challenges of, like, modeling and controlling these things, and the really exciting potential of, evolutionary development and robots that can actually change their physical form to adapt to new tasks and environments.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride. I think for me, some of the big takeaways were, just how complex the human hand is and how much it's inspiring robotic design. And then, the whole idea of robots that can grow like plants. And the fact that shape changing can actually be used for like aquatic propulsion. And then, of course, the long-term vision of robots that can like fundamentally change their form to adapt to different situations. That's just mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, this has really been like a crash course in soft robotics, and it's a field that's moving so fast. So who knows what the future holds? But, one thing's for sure, it can be fascinating to watch. So on that note, here's a final thought for you to chew on. Imagine a world where robots can not only perform tasks, but they can also like change their shape and even their intelligence through their interactions with the environment. What kind of possibilities does that open up? And what kind of challenges, might we face? It's something to think about. And we encourage you to, keep exploring these ideas because there's a lot to discover. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.